was a day like any other. Or so it seemed. The lives of countless people were about to be irrevocably altered, yet no one could have predicted the horror that would unfold. We begin our journey in a place that now exists in the forgotten corners of history. A place whose name has been wiped clean from the books, its people and their pain buried beneath the weight of time. The mass tragedy that would soon occur would echo across a community, leaving its survivors shattered and silenced. But the truly chilling part of the story wasn't just the scale of the tragedy, it was the fact that it was systematically erased from the public memory. A tragedy so dark, so unsettling, that it was purposefully removed from history's record, as though it never existed at all. Imagine waking up one morning to the realization that an event, a disaster so vast in its impact, was never meant to be remembered. How could something so significant be quietly buried? Why would anyone want to forget it? And yet, that's precisely what happened. The survivors, the witnesses, the victims, they all vanished into obscurity as though their lives and their deaths never mattered. The world moved on as if nothing had happened at all. But in the silence, the questions lingered. The tragedy in question wasn't some obscure accident. It was an event of great consequence, one that caused immense suffering and loss. It left scars on a community so deep that they couldn't be easily erased. Yet, somehow, the story of what happened here was never told. For years no one spoke about it, and those who did were quickly silenced. The people who were affected, who lived through the horror and loss, were erased from the narrative. Their voices never made it to the history books. And when the survivors tried to piece together what happened, their efforts were met with roadblocks. It was as if the world had collectively agreed to forget. But why? Why would a tragedy like this be wiped away, buried so deep that it became almost impossible to find? Was it simply an accident of time, a story lost to history like so many others? Or was there something more sinister at play? Something darker than we could ever imagine? The truth, as we would soon discover, was far more disturbing than we could have ever expected. In this world of silence, one question kept rising to the surface: what really happened? And more importantly, why was it hidden from view? Who was behind this cover-up? And why did they go to such lengths to ensure that this story would never see the light of day? At the heart of this mystery lies an unsettling truth, a truth that would take years to uncover, a truth that would require piecing together fragmented accounts, forgotten records, and missing testimonies. But as we begin to sift through the debris of history, a pattern starts to emerge. A series of small clues that, when combined, form a chilling picture. This wasn't some accidental oversight. This was deliberate. Someone, or something, wanted this story to stay buried. The tragedy itself, at its core, was simple. A sudden, catastrophic event that shook an entire community to its very foundations. It wasn't a natural disaster, nor was it some tragic accident. This was something far more insidious. It was a man-made catastrophe, the result of a series of decisions, or rather, a series of failures, that led to an irreversible outcome. The victims, who had once lived in relative peace, found themselves at the mercy of forces beyond their control. Lives were lost, families were torn apart, and entire generations were affected. And yet, when the dust settled, no one seemed to want to talk about it. There was a gap, a large, gaping hole in the historical record. The tragedy should have been front-page news. It should have been a defining moment, one that shaped the course of history. But instead it vanished. The media, for reasons unknown, turned a blind eye. The authorities, those who should have been responsible for ensuring justice, did nothing. And the public, well, the public simply forgot. As we dig deeper into the story, we start to uncover the first hints of something more sinister. The cover-up didn't happen by chance. It wasn't a mere slip of the tongue, nor was it some unintentional omission. No, this was a carefully orchestrated effort to erase the event from memory. Records were destroyed. Witnesses were intimidated, silenced, or simply made to disappear. And the families who were left behind? They were abandoned, their grief ignored, their pain forgotten. It was as if the world had collectively decided that they didn't matter. But the question still remains: why? What was it that made this tragedy so dangerous that it had to be erased? Could it be that the powers that be were trying to protect something? Maybe it was the reputation of a powerful figure, or perhaps it was the economic interests of a large corporation. Or maybe, just maybe, the event revealed something so unsettling about society that it was deemed better left buried in the past. As the pieces start to fall into place, we see a pattern emerging. The story of this tragedy is not just about the loss of life, though that is a tragic aspect in itself. It is about the power of memory, and the lengths to which those in power will go to control it. For the people who lived through this disaster, The trauma didn't end with the event itself. No, the trauma continued for years afterward, as they were made to feel like their suffering wasn't worth remembering. They were made to feel invisible. The survivors and families of the victims spent years searching for answers. They sought justice, but they were met with nothing but resistance. Some of them tried to speak out, to tell their stories, but they were quickly silenced. Some of them were even threatened, their efforts thwarted by the very institutions that were supposed to protect them. And in the end, it was as though their pain, their suffering, their very existence had been erased from history. As we dig deeper into the lives of those who lived through this tragedy, we begin to realize that the erasure of history wasn't just about forgetting the event itself. It was about the people, the lives that were lost, the families that were torn apart, and the communities that were forever changed. Their pain was never meant to be acknowledged. And as a result, their stories were silenced. This is where the real horror lies. Not in the tragedy itself, but in the fact that it was actively hidden. The people who suffered, who were left behind in the wake of this disaster, became invisible. They became ghosts in a world that had long since moved on. And in that silence, the truth remained buried. Until now. But the question still lingers in the air, unanswered. Why was this tragedy hidden from view? What was the cost of erasing the past, and who benefited from it? As we move closer to uncovering the truth, we'll begin to realize that the answer is far more complicated, and far more disturbing, than we could have ever imagined. It was a small town, nestled in a corner of the country where time seemed to stand still. The air was thick with history, yet the pages of its past were conspicuously blank. To an outsider, it seemed like an ordinary place, the kind of town you might pass through without a second glance. But to those who lived there, it was home, a place where memories lingered in every creaking floorboard and every rustling tree. Life had always been simple, though it carried the weight of an unspoken tension, an undercurrent of something hidden. But what was it about this particular town that made it so easy to forget? Why did the events that unfolded here, so dramatic in their scope, end up consigned to silence? The more we peel back the layers of this forgotten corner of the world, the more we begin to realize that it wasn't the place itself that had been forgotten. It was the people. The town was a backdrop, the stage upon which a tragedy of unimaginable proportions would soon unfold. A stage where the true horror wasn't the event itself, but the aftermath, the cover-up that followed. The town had always been unremarkable in many ways. Its quiet streets, lined with modest houses, gave the impression of a peaceful existence, a place where nothing particularly exciting ever happened. People went about their lives, raising families, working the land, and doing their best to ignore the world beyond their small community. But beneath the surface, there was an unease, an unspoken awareness that not everything was as it seemed. For years, the town had lived under the shadow of something, a secret, a buried truth, that would eventually come to the forefront in the most unimaginable way. There were whispers, of course. Every town has them. The old-timers spoke in hushed tones, sharing stories of things that had happened long before the younger generations were born. But these were not the kinds of stories that made it into the history books. These were the stories that lingered in the cracks and crevices, stories that were only spoken about in the dead of night, when no one else was listening. They spoke of lives lost, of families torn apart, and of something far darker that had occurred in the past, something that the town seemed to want to forget, or perhaps, was forced to forget. The year of the tragedy was significant, though not for the reasons you might expect. The world around the town was changing, the winds of history blowing in ways that would soon make their mark. Wars were being fought, economies were shifting, and people were on the move looking for something better, something safer. But in this small, forgotten town, life carried on as it always had. It was a time of innocence for many, a time when the world seemed far away. The people who lived there were proud of their history, their traditions, and the life they had built in this quiet corner of the world. But they were also vulnerable in ways they couldn't fully understand. It all started with a single event, a moment that no one could have predicted. At first, it seemed like a passing inconvenience, something that would soon be forgotten. But as the days passed, it became clear that this was no ordinary incident. What had begun as a small problem soon grew into something far more serious, something that threatened the very fabric of the town. It was the kind of event that, in hindsight, should have been a warning, a turning point. But at the time, no one truly understood the magnitude of what was happening. As the tragedy unfolded, the people of the town were forced to confront a reality they had never anticipated. What they thought was a simple misstep, a minor disaster, was in fact a much larger catastrophe that had been years in the making. And as the situation spiraled out of control, it became apparent that there were forces at work far beyond their understanding, forces that would stop at nothing to ensure that the truth remained hidden. The event itself was chaotic, unpredictable, and terrifying. Lives were lost, families were shattered, and the community was thrown into disarray. The once quiet streets were filled with panic, confusion, and grief. And yet, in the midst of all this, there was something even more sinister happening just out of sight, a quiet, methodical effort to ensure that the truth would never be told. At first, the town's leaders tried to downplay the incident. They assured the people that everything was under control, that there was no need for alarm. But as the scope of the disaster became clear, it became obvious that this was no longer something they could handle on their own. Outside help was needed, and quickly. But what was most striking about the response was the complete lack of urgency, the lack of genuine concern for the victims. There were no heroes coming to the rescue, no brave men and women rushing to the aid of those who had been affected. Instead, there was only a cold, calculated response that served one purpose: to contain the damage, to bury the story before it could spread. Behind the scenes, a different kind of response was unfolding. While the townspeople scrambled to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, the powers that be, those in positions of authority, were quietly working to ensure that the incident would never be spoken of again. Records were destroyed, witnesses were silenced, and any trace of the event that could be used to piece together the truth was eradicated. It was a cover-up of epic proportions, a carefully orchestrated effort to make sure that no one would ever know what had truly happened. For years, the town remained in a kind of suspended animation. Life went on, but the event that had once shaken it to its core was never mentioned again. It was as if the collective memory of the town had been wiped clean, as if the tragedy had never occurred in the first place. The people who had lived through it were left to carry their scars in silence, their pain buried deep inside. Those who tried to speak out were ignored, dismissed as paranoid or delusional. Their stories were lost to time, as if the world had decided that it was better off forgetting. But no matter how hard the powers that be tried to bury the truth, there were always those who refused to let it die. Survivors, descendants of the victims, and a few brave souls who sought justice kept searching for answers. They dug through archives, interviewed old-timers, and pieced together fragmented accounts, hoping to uncover what had truly happened. And though their efforts were often met with resistance, their persistence paid off. Slowly, the truth began to surface, like a long-drowned body finally breaking the surface of the water. But what they uncovered was more disturbing than they could have ever imagined. The cover-up wasn't just a matter of neglect or incompetence. It was intentional. The people behind it had gone to great lengths to ensure that the event would be erased from history. They had manipulated records, twisted narratives, and silenced anyone who dared to speak the truth. And the more they uncovered, the more they realized that this wasn't just about a single event, it was about a system, a structure, that had been built to protect those in power at any cost. A system that was willing to sacrifice everything, even the truth, to maintain the status quo. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, it became clear that this tragedy was not just a forgotten moment in time. It was part of a larger pattern, a pattern of history being manipulated and erased to serve the interests of those in power. The people who had suffered, who had lost so much, were nothing more than casualties in a battle for control over the past. And in the end, the real question wasn't what had happened, it was why no one had cared enough to stop it. The town, once a place of relative peace, had become a symbol of everything that had been lost. It was a place where history had been rewritten, where the truth had been silenced, and where the memory of a tragedy had been buried so deeply that it seemed destined to remain forgotten forever. But even in the darkness, a flicker of light remained. And as the story continued to unfold, it became clear that the fight for truth was far from over. In the aftermath of the tragedy, the people who lived through it found themselves trapped in a haunting silence. They had seen things no one should ever have to witness. They had lived through the unthinkable. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, something even more sinister began to unfold. The memories of what had happened were not just fading, they were being erased. Not by time but by design. It wasn't just the physical wreckage of the disaster that was being buried, it was the very identity of those who had been affected, the very essence of their pain. And in this absence of acknowledgement, a powerful force began to shape the lives of those left behind. The survivors, the families of the victims, were left in a state of profound isolation. No one talked about the event. No one asked questions. The world seemed to have moved on without them, as though their suffering was not worthy of recognition. The local community, once tightly knit, became fractured, divided by a shared secret no one could openly address. The survivors couldn't even find solace in the company of those who had experienced the same horrors. Everyone was afraid of speaking out, terrified of being labeled as troublemakers or worse as liars. They were haunted by the knowledge of what had been lost, not just in terms of lives but in terms of history. Their stories were never told, their grief never acknowledged, and their pain never allowed to surface. It was as if they were living in a void, where the past was not only forgotten, but actively erased. It wasn't just the event that had been removed from the collective memory, it was the very people who had endured it. The survivors found themselves struggling to make sense of a world that had ignored them, a world that had denied their existence in the very fabric of history. In the years that followed, a strange kind of amnesia set in. For the rest of the world, the tragedy had never happened. There were no memorials, no anniversaries to mark the day, no one to speak for the victims or to stand up for the survivors. It was as though the entire event had been wiped clean from the public record, as though it had never existed. And yet the survivors knew. They knew what had happened. They knew the faces of those they had lost, the moments they had shared with them before everything fell apart. They carried the weight of that knowledge every single day, but there was no one to share it with. The survivors tried to move on with their lives, but how do you move on from something so monumental, so world-shattering, when no one else acknowledges that it ever occurred? How do you find peace when the world tells you that you never mattered, that your pain never counted? They found themselves wandering through a world that had forgotten them, trapped in a painful limbo between the memory of what they had lost and the indifference of a society that refused to remember. And as much as they wanted to forget, they couldn't. The memories haunted them, clinging to their thoughts like shadows that never left. But there were others who refused to accept the silence. There were whispers among the survivors, and soon those whispers turned into voices. Some of them began to meet in secret, to compare their stories, to exchange the small fragments of information they had clung to over the years. Slowly the truth began to emerge piece by piece. The survivors began to realize that they were not alone in their suffering, that there were others who had lived through the same nightmare. And with that realization came a spark of hope. Hope that the truth could still be told, that the story of what had happened could be brought to light, even if the world didn't want to hear it. But the deeper they dug into the past, the more they began to uncover. At first, it was small things. Old newspapers with missing articles, family photos with the faces of those who had been erased from the official records. But soon they discovered something much darker, something that had been deliberately hidden from them. The cover-up didn't just involve silencing the survivors or erasing the records of the tragedy. No, it went much deeper than that. It involved the systematic destruction of lives, of entire families whose names had been erased from history. It wasn't just a matter of forgetting, it was a matter of obliterating. As they pieced together their memories and the bits of evidence they had gathered, the survivors began to understand the full scope of what had happened. This wasn't just an accident, an unfortunate event that was swept under the rug. This was something far more calculated, something that had been carefully orchestrated by those who had the power to erase the truth. It became clear that the tragedy had not only been covered up, it had been deliberately obscured in a way that would prevent future generations from ever knowing the truth. The survivors were not the only ones who had suffered. The families of the victims, those who had lost loved ones in the disaster, were also left in the dark. Their loved ones had been forgotten, their stories never told. Their grief had been disregarded, their pain minimized. And yet, as the survivors began to dig into the past, they discovered that these families had been actively silenced as well. Some had been paid off, others had been threatened into silence, and a few had simply disappeared altogether. It was as though the world had conspired to ensure that these families would never be heard from again. In the quiet corners of the town, there were people who remembered. Old-timers who had seen what had happened, who had witnessed the event firsthand, but who were now too afraid to speak. The more the survivors pushed for answers, the more they realized that there were people who knew the truth but who had been too scared to come forward. And so, the search for the truth became a battle not just against those who had orchestrated the cover-up, but against a culture of fear that had been instilled in the community over years of suppression and silence. But as they dug deeper, the survivors uncovered a chilling pattern. The event that had shattered their lives wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger scheme, a series of events that had been systematically erased from history. What had happened in their town was not an anomaly, it was part of a much bigger, more complex story that stretched far beyond their small community. And as they began to put the pieces together, they realized that the tragedy had been just the tip of the iceberg. What lay beneath the surface was far more disturbing than they had ever imagined. The survivors knew that they couldn't keep this to themselves any longer. They couldn't live in the shadows any longer, pretending that the world's amnesia was the only truth that mattered. They knew that they had a duty not just to themselves, but to the memory of those who had been lost. And so they began to speak out. Slowly, carefully, they began to share their stories with the world. They reached out to journalists, to historians, to anyone who might listen. And as they did, something remarkable began to happen. The truth started to spread, slowly but surely. At first, the world refused to acknowledge what had happened. But with each new voice that joined the chorus, with each new piece of evidence that came to light, the truth became undeniable. The survivors refused to be silenced any longer. The world had forgotten them, but they would make sure that their story would never be erased again. The tragedy, once hidden in the shadows, was finally coming into the light. And the people who had been denied their voices for so long were finally being heard. It was when the survivors began to piece together their shattered lives that the gravity of what had really happened started to come into focus. It wasn't just the trauma of the event itself that they were left to bear, but the overwhelming realization that their stories, their very existence, had been erased from history. There had been a conscious effort to remove the incident from public consciousness, and with it, the painful realities that accompanied it. The more they dug, the more they unearthed fragments of a deliberate erasure, a series of calculated steps taken to bury the truth. At first, the pieces of the puzzle were small, almost insignificant. Small details, odd inconsistencies in local records, documents that didn't quite match up. But as the survivors began to compare their experiences, as they met and shared their memories, a larger picture began to form. These weren't just isolated incidents. They were part of a larger web of deliberate obfuscation. What had once seemed like an inconsequential cover-up now appeared to be a sophisticated, coordinated effort to rewrite the very narrative of the tragedy. The survivors discovered that their recollections of the event, once dismissed as unreliable or exaggerated, were in fact the only accurate accounts of what had occurred. The authorities had been quick to suppress any attempt to uncover the truth, shutting down investigations, destroying evidence, and discrediting anyone who dared to speak out. The tragedy had occurred in the dead of night, when the world was least likely to notice. But there had been whispers, those who had seen the wreckage, those who had lived through it, those who had suffered in its wake. These voices were gradually silenced, not by force but by fear. The fear of a power too great, too pervasive to be challenged. The people who had lived through the nightmare understood that the real horror wasn't just in what had happened, but in the way the world had moved on, as if nothing had ever occurred. The families who had lost loved ones in the disaster were left to cope with the overwhelming grief, while those who had survived were left to carry the mental and emotional scars of their experiences. The tragedy was quietly buried beneath a veil of apathy, and in its place, a fabricated story began to take root. But for the survivors, the lie was impossible to ignore. As they began to search for answers, they discovered that many of the documents relating to the incident had been altered, deleted, or completely destroyed. Newspaper clippings that once held crucial details about the event had mysteriously vanished, leaving behind empty spaces where the story should have been. Files containing records of the victims had been carefully expunged, their names crossed out in black ink as if they had never existed. Even photographs, once thought to be the only remaining evidence of the tragedy, had been removed from public archives, leaving no trace of what had happened. It became apparent that the authorities had not only worked to suppress the details of the event, but had also gone to great lengths to ensure that no one would ever look for them. Witnesses who had survived the tragedy, those who had seen the destruction with their own eyes, were either too frightened to speak out or too disillusioned by the years of neglect to believe that their voices would ever be heard. The survivors who had dared to question the official story were labeled as troublemakers, their motives questioned, their credibility dismissed. But even in the face of such overwhelming opposition, the survivors refused to give up. They knew that they had to find the truth, not just for themselves but for the victims whose names and faces had been erased from history. They continued to search for the missing pieces, to track down the fragments of their collective memory, hoping that one day they could piece together the truth of what had happened. It wasn't easy. Every step forward was met with resistance. Every discovery was followed by another obstacle. But they pressed on, driven by a sense of justice that could not be extinguished. It was through this relentless search for truth that the survivors uncovered something shocking, something that would forever change the way they viewed the tragedy. They learned that the cover-up had not been an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger conspiracy, one that involved individuals in positions of power who had a vested interest in keeping the tragedy buried. The disaster had not been some random, unfortunate event. It had been a deliberate act, one that had been planned and executed with the intent of minimizing the fallout and maintaining control over the narrative. The survivors began to connect the dots, tracing the web of influence that had allowed the cover-up to thrive. They learned that those in power, whether they were local officials, powerful corporations, or even national figures, had made a conscious decision to bury the truth. The tragedy had been a threat to their interests, to their reputations, and to their hold on power. And so, they had acted quickly to stifle any attempts to expose the truth, using their influence to ensure that the story would never see the light of day. But the more the survivors uncovered, the more they realized just how deep the conspiracy ran. The cover-up had not only involved the destruction of evidence and the silencing of witnesses, but had extended to the manipulation of the public's memory. The media, which should have been the ones to report the truth, had instead been complicit in the conspiracy. News outlets, once trusted to provide the public with accurate information, had either ignored the tragedy altogether or had reported a version of events that was crafted to serve the interests of those in power. Even the legal system, which was supposed to seek justice for the victims, had been compromised. Investigations into the disaster had been closed prematurely, with no real answers ever provided. The victims' families were denied the closure they so desperately needed, and the survivors were left with nothing but the haunting knowledge that the truth was just out of reach. As the survivors uncovered more of the conspiracy, they realized that they had been living in a world shaped by lies. The official story, the one that had been fed to the public, was nothing but a carefully crafted fiction. The real story, the one that had been buried, was one of betrayal, greed, and corruption. And the more they learned, the more they understood that the tragedy had been only the beginning. It was part of a larger pattern, a pattern of control, manipulation, and secrecy that had been woven into the very fabric of society. But even in the face of such overwhelming evidence, there were still those who refused to believe. There were still people who clung to the official story, who dismissed the survivors as conspiracy theorists or attention seekers. They were told that it was better to forget, that the past was the past, and that there was no point in dredging up old wounds. But for the survivors there was no other choice. They had to continue their fight for the truth, for the victims whose names had been erased, and for the future generations who needed to understand what had happened. With every new revelation the stakes grew higher. The survivors realized that this wasn't just about a single tragedy, it was about something much bigger, something that affected the entire fabric of society. The truth of what had happened in their town wasn't just a local story, it was a microcosm of the way power, corruption, and control operated on a larger scale. And as they uncovered more about the conspiracy, they began to see just how deeply these forces had shaped their world, how the lies they had been told had influenced the course of history. It wasn't just about righting a wrong anymore. It was about uncovering a hidden truth that had been buried for far too long. The survivors, once isolated and forgotten, had become the voices of the truth. They had found the courage to speak out, to demand answers, and to ensure that the tragedy of their town would not be lost to history. They knew that it would be a long and difficult journey, but they also knew that it was the only path forward. The truth was out there, and they would stop at nothing to find it. The deeper the survivors delved into the mystery, the more their initial shock began to give way to a burning resolve. The truth, they knew now, wasn't just buried in forgotten archives or in the hollow spaces of their memories. It had been meticulously erased from the world around them, systematically, deliberately. Their memories, the lives they had lived, the loved ones they had lost, were nothing but casualties in a much larger scheme to conceal the reality of what had occurred. Each new piece of information they uncovered seemed to serve as a reminder that the battle they were fighting was not only one of truth, but also one of memory, a fight to ensure that the past could no longer be manipulated or erased. But even as they began to piece the past together, new obstacles presented themselves. The web of deception they were unraveling was far more complex than they had ever imagined. The institutions and individuals behind the cover-up were not simply passive bystanders. They were active participants, their hands stained with the consequences of their actions. And in their effort to erase history, they had created a system so tightly woven that it was almost impossible to break. But for the survivors, this was no longer just about justice. It was about survival. To bring the truth to light, they knew they would have to face not just the ghosts of the past, but the very forces that had conspired to silence them in the first place. As the survivors continued their investigation, it became clear that the tragedy wasn't merely a failure of governance or a slip-up by those in power, it was a well-executed plan, set into motion by those who knew exactly what they were doing. The scale of the cover-up was staggering, and as they dug deeper, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place with terrifying precision. What had been sold to the world as an unfortunate event, a tragic but ultimately inconsequential incident, was in reality a carefully orchestrated disaster, hidden in plain sight. The more they uncovered, the more they realized just how deep the conspiracy ran, how high it reached, and how determined those in power were to protect their interests at any cost. In the weeks and months that followed, the survivors found themselves piecing together a narrative that was far more disturbing than they had anticipated. It wasn't just the destruction of evidence or the silencing of witnesses, it was the manipulation of the very framework of society, a web of lies so intricate that it required generations of effort to maintain. There were local officials, yes, but their reach extended far beyond the town, reaching into the highest echelons of power. Corporations had been complicit, using their influence to shape public perception and avoid scrutiny. The media, once seen as the watchdog of society, had played its part in keeping the truth hidden, offering up convenient half-truths while ensuring that the real story remained buried. And all the while, the people who had lived through the nightmare, those who had borne the brunt of the tragedy, were left to pick up the pieces, their voices drowned out by the chorus of those who preferred the lie. The survivors were not blind to the difficulty of what they were attempting. They knew that exposing the full scope of the cover-up would come at a price. It wasn't just about confronting the people who had been responsible, it was about challenging a system that had been built on lies, a system that relied on the silence of the people to survive. To uncover the truth meant risking everything. The survivors could lose their homes, their families, and their livelihoods. But they also understood that if they remained silent, the tragedy would be lost forever. The people who had died, the families who had suffered, they would become nothing but ghosts, their stories buried in a forgotten corner of history. For the survivors, there was no other choice. They began to speak out, cautiously at first. They approached journalists who were willing to listen, historians who had been skeptical but curious. Slowly, the truth began to take shape, but every revelation brought more danger. Their lives were increasingly under threat, their every move watched. The powerful figures behind the cover-up had not forgotten them. They were still out there, watching, waiting, ready to crush anyone who dared to challenge the narrative. But the survivors were undeterred. Their memories, those fragments they had clung to for so long, were all they had left. They could not let those memories be erased again. As the investigation gathered momentum, more people began to come forward. Survivors of the tragedy who had once been too afraid to speak now found strength in numbers. Families of victims who had long accepted their losses began to demand justice. The voices that had been silenced for so long were beginning to rise together, and with each voice came another piece of the truth. Yet, as the survivors grew closer to the heart of the conspiracy, they began to realize just how far-reaching and insidious the cover-up had truly been. This was no ordinary conspiracy, it was a carefully calculated effort to rewrite history itself. The key to understanding the cover-up lay in the systematic manipulation of public memory. The tragedy, which had been so shocking in its scope, had posed a threat to those in power. It threatened to expose the vulnerabilities in the system, the corrupt underpinnings that kept society functioning on a foundation of lies. The people who had been responsible for the cover-up weren't merely protecting their reputations, they were protecting a system that had allowed them to thrive. And in order to protect that system, they had destroyed the lives of those who had dared to speak out. The survivors knew that their struggle wasn't just about uncovering the truth, it was about reclaiming their place in history. Their stories, their pain, their loss had been erased, but now, slowly, they were carving out a space for themselves. Each new revelation brought them closer to the truth, but it also put them at greater risk. The forces they were up against were powerful, and they would stop at nothing to ensure that the past remained buried. The survivors began to realize that they weren't just fighting for justice. They were fighting for the future of their town, their community, and their children. If they failed, the story of what had happened would be lost forever. But the further the survivors dug, the more they began to uncover the terrifying scope of the conspiracy. This was no mere cover-up. It was a comprehensive attempt to erase an entire chapter of history. Every shred of evidence was scrubbed away, every potential witness silenced. The tragedy, the lives that had been lost, had been written out of existence. It was as if it had never happened at all. The survivors understood that exposing the truth would not be easy, and the closer they came to the heart of the conspiracy, the more they realized just how high the stakes were. They could not afford to back down now, not when so many had already suffered. Their fight wasn't just for themselves, it was for the future, for the generations who would never know what had happened unless they took action. As the final pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, the survivors faced a heartbreaking realization. The tragedy they had lived through, the lives that had been lost, the families that had been torn apart, these were not just isolated events. They were part of a much larger narrative, one that spanned decades, one that involved the highest levels of power. And the story of their town, once seen as a forgotten chapter in history, was now emerging as a crucial piece of a much greater puzzle. The survivors had no illusions about the risks they faced, but they also knew that they had no other choice. The truth had to be told. They had already lost so much and they could not afford to lose their story as well. So, with renewed determination, they pressed on, pushing against the darkness that had swallowed their past, determined to bring the light of truth into every corner of the shadowy conspiracy that had stolen their history from them. As the investigation continued to unfold, the survivors began to realize the sheer magnitude of the forces they were up against. It wasn't just the silence of the town that they were fighting. It was a deep-rooted system of corruption that stretched far beyond the borders of their small community. It wasn't just the local authorities who were complicit, it was the very institutions that were supposed to protect them, the legal systems, the media, even powerful corporations that had an interest in keeping the truth buried. This was no longer just about a tragic event, it was about an ongoing cover-up, a conspiracy that was alive and well, working tirelessly to suppress any efforts to bring the truth to light. And with each new discovery, the survivors realized they were facing an insidious network of power and influence that had been in place for years. The closer they came to the truth, the more it became evident that the tragedy wasn't just an unfortunate accident. It had been part of a larger plan, a larger design, one that involved the manipulation of not just the events that led up to it but the aftermath as well. The way it had been swept under the rug, the way the world had collectively turned its back on the victims, this wasn't just negligence or incompetence. It was deliberate, calculated. The tragedy had been a threat to those who had the power to control the narrative, and they had acted swiftly to eliminate it. But even in the face of such overwhelming opposition, the survivors were relentless. They were no longer willing to allow the past to be buried under layers of lies. They began to dig deeper, pushing against the barriers that had been erected to keep them from uncovering the truth. Every lead they followed, every new piece of information they uncovered, revealed a deeper level of corruption, a more sophisticated cover-up. The investigation became an intricate web, and the more they pulled at the threads, the more they realized just how much was at stake. One of the most painful aspects of their search for the truth was realizing just how many people had been complicit in the cover-up. The survivors had long believed that the silence surrounding the tragedy was due to indifference or ignorance. But as they uncovered more, it became clear that the silence had been orchestrated, deliberately maintained by those who knew exactly what had happened. The victims had been forgotten not because no one cared, but because it had been in the best interest of powerful individuals to ensure that no one remembered. The tragedy had been erased not out of forgetfulness, but out of necessity. The survivors were no strangers to adversity, but they had never faced anything like this before. It was one thing to battle the emotional scars left by the event itself. It was another to confront a system that had deliberately sought to erase their story, their very existence. The more they uncovered, the more they realized the full extent of the conspiracy. They learned that their town had been a test case, a small-scale experiment in how to control public memory, how to erase inconvenient truths, how to manipulate history itself. The efforts to erase the tragedy were more than just a local affair. It quickly became apparent that what had happened in their town was not an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern, one that stretched across the country and beyond. The same methods of manipulation, the same tactics of silencing victims, were being employed elsewhere. What they had thought was a unique injustice was in fact part of a much larger and more insidious operation. They had been led to believe that they were alone, that no one else understood their pain. But now they realized they were part of a much larger narrative, a narrative that stretched back decades, perhaps even centuries. As the survivors dug deeper, they began to uncover documents, testimonies, and historical records that linked their tragedy to other events, other cover-ups, and other forgotten histories. The patterns were undeniable. The same people, the same institutions were involved in erasing the stories of those who had been wronged. The survivors realized that they were not just fighting for justice for themselves, they were fighting for the recognition of countless other victims whose stories had never been told, whose names had never been spoken. Their struggle was no longer just about uncovering the truth, it was about exposing a systemic attempt to bury history itself. But the further they went, the more dangerous their mission became. The powers that had worked so tirelessly to suppress the truth were not going to let it slip away without a fight. The survivors had learned that their investigation had attracted attention, and not the kind they had hoped for. They were being watched, their every move scrutinized. The forces behind the cover-up were willing to go to extreme lengths to stop them. Some survivors began receiving threatening phone calls, others found their homes vandalized, their personal lives invaded in ways that made it impossible for them to continue their work in peace. The danger they faced was no longer abstract, it was real, palpable. The powers that be were making it clear that they would stop at nothing to maintain control of the narrative. But even in the face of these threats, the survivors refused to back down. They had come too far to turn back now. They had uncovered too much, and they had uncovered it together. Their bonds had grown stronger through their shared suffering, and they knew that they could not, and would not, be silenced again. The truth was out there, and they were determined to see it through to the end. Their perseverance began to pay off. Journalists, once skeptical, began to take their claims seriously. Investigations, previously abandoned, were reopened. People who had once been too afraid to speak out began to come forward, adding their voices to the chorus of those demanding justice. The survivors were no longer alone in their struggle. They had found allies, people who had also suffered, people who had seen the same patterns, people who understood the weight of their fight. With each new ally, with each new voice, their power grew. The narrative that had been carefully constructed to erase the tragedy was starting to unravel. But even as the walls of silence began to crack, the survivors knew that they were far from safe. The forces they were up against were not going to give up without a fight. The cover-up had been in place for too long, and those responsible were too powerful to let their empire of lies collapse without resistance. The survivors knew that they had to act quickly before they were crushed by the full weight of the system that had oppressed them for so long. They began to organize, to coordinate their efforts, to bring the truth to as many people as possible. They knew that the more people who knew the truth, the harder it would be for those responsible to continue hiding it. They reached out to people in positions of power, to those who had the resources to help them amplify their message. They connected with historians who could shed light on the forgotten aspects of the past, journalists who could bring the story to the forefront, and legal experts who could help them fight for justice. The survivors understood that the battle they were waging was not just about uncovering the past, it was about shaping the future. It was about ensuring that no one else would suffer as they had. But with every victory came a new setback. Every new piece of evidence uncovered, every story told, seemed to be met with a fresh wave of resistance. It was clear that the fight for the truth was far from over. Those who had tried to erase the past were not going to give up easily. But as long as the survivors had each other, as long as they had the courage to continue, they knew they would never stop fighting. As their efforts gained momentum, the survivors realized that they were no longer simply fighting to right a wrong. They were fighting for the memory of all those who had been forgotten, for the dignity of those whose names had been erased. The fight had become something much greater than they had ever anticipated. They were no longer just a small group of people seeking justice. They had become a symbol of resistance, a beacon for all those who had ever been silenced, forgotten, or ignored. The world may have tried to bury their story, but they were determined to ensure that the truth would never be buried again. As the survivors' quest for the truth gained momentum, a sense of urgency settled over their efforts. The more they unearthed, the more they began to realize just how far the conspiracy stretched. What had initially seemed like a small-scale cover-up was now unfolding into something far darker, more pervasive, and more calculated than they had imagined. The townspeople who had been silent for years, the families who had suffered in isolation, and the individuals who had witnessed the horrors all played a crucial role in the larger story, a story that was gradually revealing its horrifying scope. With each new revelation, the survivors grew bolder. Their initial fear of retribution had slowly begun to fade, replaced by a deep sense of resolve. They had come to understand that their struggle was no longer about their own pain, but about the collective suffering of so many others. This wasn't just their town's tragedy, it was a tale shared by countless others who had been silenced, ignored, or erased from history. What they had lived through, what they had witnessed, was not an anomaly but part of a broader, systemic attempt to control the narrative of history itself. And yet, as their fight progressed, the resistance they encountered became more intense. Those behind the cover-up were not just powerful, they were ruthless. The survivors had hoped that, with time, they could build enough momentum to expose the truth, but what they hadn't accounted for was the sheer determination of the forces aligned against them. These weren't just individuals in positions of local power, these were people with the resources to silence entire communities, to manipulate media narratives, and to crush any attempt to expose their secrets. Every attempt to push forward seemed to result in new obstacles. Local officials, once merely passive participants in the cover-up, were now actively working to undermine the survivors. The media, which had once ignored the tragedy, now began to twist the facts, framing the survivors' efforts as sensationalist or unfounded. Journalists who had initially been eager to take on the story found themselves pressured to abandon their investigation. Threats, both subtle and overt, became more frequent. The survivors found their phones tapped, their homes under surveillance, their movements tracked. They were being watched by shadowy figures who seemed to have no qualms about employing any means necessary to ensure their silence. But even in the face of these threats, the survivors remained undeterred. They had learned long ago that they couldn't rely on the systems meant to protect them. These institutions were compromised, if not outright corrupt. It wasn't just a matter of seeking justice within the framework of the law. It was about breaking through the layers of deception, the centuries-old structures that perpetuated power and control. They couldn't afford to trust the legal system, the media, or even the people they had once considered allies. They had to rely on themselves and on each other. With every step forward, the survivors discovered more pieces to the puzzle that revealed the extent of the cover-up. It wasn't just the government officials, the media, or the corporations that were involved. It was an entire network of institutions, both public and private, that had colluded to suppress the truth. The tragedy in their town was not isolated. It was part of a much larger story, a pattern of erasure that extended across the country and perhaps even beyond. What they had thought was a regional issue now seemed like a global conspiracy to rewrite history, to bury uncomfortable truths, and to control the flow of information. As the survivors dug deeper into the past, they uncovered evidence that pointed to a much more deliberate and coordinated effort than they had ever realized. The erasure of their story was not a matter of negligence. It was a calculated move by powerful people who saw the tragedy as a threat. It had the potential to expose corruption, to shine a light on the darkest corners of the system, and to disrupt the delicate balance of power that kept society functioning as it had for centuries. They began to uncover documents, records, and eyewitness accounts that painted a picture of a sophisticated conspiracy. A conspiracy designed to suppress not only the truth of the event but also the memories of those who had lived through it. The families of the victims had been paid off, threatened, or simply silenced. Many survivors had been subjected to psychological warfare, manipulated into thinking they had imagined the entire event. Those who refused to be silent were labeled as mentally unstable, their stories dismissed as nothing more than the ramblings of grief-stricken individuals. It wasn't just a matter of erasing the event, it was about erasing the people who had lived it. One of the most disturbing aspects of their discovery was realizing how well organized the cover-up had been. The survivors had assumed that they were up against a few corrupt individuals or institutions, but they now realized they were fighting a much larger, more deeply ingrained system of control. This wasn't just about hiding the past, it was about controlling the future. By erasing the truth of what had happened in their town, those in power had ensured that future generations would never know the full story. The tragedy had been deliberately buried, not because it was inconvenient, but because it threatened to expose the fragile foundation of the system that upheld power. In the face of this growing realization, the survivors began to take more drastic steps. They knew that the only way to bring the truth to light was to expose the conspiracy for what it was, a coordinated, global effort to manipulate history and control the narrative. They reached out to international organizations, to independent investigators who had no ties to the corrupt systems that had been complicit in the cover-up. They turned to whistleblowers, individuals who had worked in the institutions involved and who were willing to risk everything to speak out. But as their investigation gained more attention, so too did the risks they faced. The survivors had come to understand that their battle for truth was not just about bringing closure to their own community, it was about standing up to an entrenched system of power that had been working to keep the truth buried for decades. The very institutions they had once trusted were now their enemies, and the more they uncovered, the more they realized just how high the stakes had become. The survivors knew that the fight would be long, and they were under no illusions about the difficulties that lay ahead. They had already lost so much, friends, family, and the peace of mind they once took for granted. But they had also gained something far more valuable, the strength of their unity. They had become a community of resistance, bound together not just by their shared experiences, but by the unshakable belief that the truth had to be told. Together they had become a force, and together they knew they could continue the fight for as long as it took. Yet, as they took their story to the public, they were met with growing opposition. Every attempt to share the truth, to expose the corruption and the conspiracy, was met with increasing hostility. The media tried to discredit them, the authorities tried to intimidate them, and the public grew increasingly divided. Some people were sympathetic to their cause, eager to hear the truth, while others were manipulated by the misinformation being spread by the very institutions that had once held their trust. The battle for the truth was not just against the powers that had orchestrated the cover-up, it was against the minds of the public, who had been conditioned to believe in the lies that had been fed to them for so long. But the survivors remained determined. The more the world tried to bury their story, the more they were fueled by the knowledge that they were on the right path. They were not just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for history itself, for the truth that had been stolen from them and from the countless others whose stories had been erased. They knew that the battle ahead would be a difficult one, and that there would be many more sacrifices to come, but they also knew that they could never stop. The truth was worth the fight. The truth was worth everything. As the survivors delved deeper into the conspiracy, the weight of their findings began to take its toll. Each revelation brought with it a new layer of grief, a deeper wound to the already fragile fabric of their lives. The further they pushed to expose the truth, the more they were reminded of just how deeply the past had been buried, how carefully the veil had been drawn over their suffering. It wasn't just about finding justice for themselves anymore, it was about confronting a world that had been complicit in the erasure of their very existence. They had known from the start that the journey ahead would be difficult, but they had never fully understood the breadth of the resistance they would face. As the web of corruption and deception grew larger, the survivors began to realize that the very foundation of their town, and perhaps even the larger societal structures that held it up, had been built on lies. The systems that were supposed to protect the innocent, to ensure justice, were deeply compromised. The survivors had always known there were powerful forces at play, but now they understood just how far those forces stretched, and how embedded they were in every aspect of their lives. What had started as a search for truth had transformed into a battle for the very soul of their community, their history, and their future. The survivors were no longer just a small group of individuals trying to uncover a painful past. They had become symbols of resistance, a reminder that the truth could not be suppressed forever, no matter how much power tried to bury it. And yet, with every step they took toward that truth, they found themselves in more danger. They were not only fighting to expose the corruption and lies of the past, they were fighting to survive in a world that seemed intent on crushing them. The more they uncovered, the more they realized the scale of the conspiracy they were up against. It wasn't just about silencing a few witnesses or erasing a handful of documents, it was about an organized effort to manipulate history itself. The tragedy that had devastated their lives had been hidden, not because it was an isolated incident, but because it was a threat to something much larger. Those who had orchestrated the cover-up were not simply trying to protect their reputations, they were trying to protect an entire system of control that relied on the suppression of uncomfortable truths. And to maintain that system, they were willing to go to any lengths, including threatening, silencing, and destroying the lives of those who stood in their way.